Welcome everyone. I'm delighted to introduce you to this seminar, which is hosted by the Abolition, Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence Collective, which is on the Imbroglio of Ecocide. Sorry, something's just falling over. The cat's attacked something in the back of the room. The Imbroglio of Ecocide, a political economic analysis by Emily Jones and Eliana Cusato, and it's going to be chaired by Christine Schwöbel-Patel. So I'm just here to do a very brief introduction to Christine and then hand over to her to do proper introduction for Emily and Eliana. So Christine is a professor of law at the University of Warwick and is currently a visiting fellow at Cambridge University's Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. And I'm sure many of you here will already know of her work, which is on international law and political economy and aesthetics. She already has 2 monographs in this topic and currently is working on a co-edited collection which will be out very shortly with Counterpress, which is on aesthetics and counter-aesthetics of international justice. So thanks so much for chairing today, Christine. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be chairing this, and welcome everyone. It's so wonderful to see such interest in this piece and in this event. I dare say it has a lot to do with the topic, but even more to do with the wonderful authors Eliana and Emily, who both not so long ago published path-breaking books that have created a following and curiosity about what they turn their attention to next. So let me briefly introduce the topic of the seminar, and then the speakers, Eliana and Emily, will give a presentation of their piece. So if you haven't read it yet, then they will be going through the main points, and then we'll turn to a Q&A, and hopefully we should still have a good 25 minutes for the Q&A. So the article we'll be learning about today, the Imbroglio of Ecocide, a political economic analysis. I just want to say that Eliana can say the word imbroglio so much in such a better way than I can. So looking forward to that. Was published in the Leiden Journal of International Law not too long ago. And it's a critical analysis of a term that has attracted substantial academic and public attention, namely the crime of ecocide. Eliana and Emily write, the current campaign to codify the crime of ecocide under international criminal law represents the epitome of a problem-solving approach which conceives of the law as external to society and as a corrective to its evils. So I think that sentence really encapsulates what their research is about, but also why this is such a timely piece. And there are many reasons why it is timely. Just want to highlight 2. As you know, COP28 is currently taking place in Dubai, and despite the posturing about fossil fuel phase out, the industry does not only remain strong, it continues to aggressively expand, in particular on the African continent, where new territories for fossil fuel extraction continue to be scoped out. There's an urgent need to think about the relationship of international law and climate catastrophe and the symbolism that international law is involved in. Now, it's also urgent for us to attend to a broad evaluation of international law as we see the systematic targeting of civilians in Gaza and the veto of the US at the Security Council, of course, the abstention of the UK for humanitarian assistance there. It's time that we really start asking ourselves and how far it is delusional even to think about international lawyers as employing law as a corrective to society's evil. So Dr. Eliana Cusato is an assistant professor at the Amsterdam Center for International Law at the University of Amsterdam. Her research explores the interrelation of political ecology and economy, violence and conflict in the theory and practice of international law. She has published widely, including, and I wanted to mention this, a prize-winning piece in the London Review of International Law. She's author, as you probably know, of The Ecology of War and Peace, Marginalizing Slow and Structural Violence in International Law, which is published with the UP. Dr. Emily Jones is a fellow at Newcastle Law School. In her research, teaching and practice, she examines modes of resistance and hope, drawing on feminist, queer, post-human, decolonial, and critical disability studies. Emily's monograph, could I just ask, Sarita, would you be able to mute yourself? There we go. Emily's monograph, Feminist Theory and International Law, Post-Human Perspectives, was recently published with Routledge, and it has attracted a lot of attention and discussion. Emily is also the co-author of The Law of War and Peace, a Gender Analysis, and has co-edited 2 volumes, the More Post-Human Glossary and International Law and Post-Human Theory, which will be out soon. So I'll hand over to Emily and Eliana for a presentation of the piece that we're discussing today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much to Nikki and the other organizer and the Abolition Feminist Collective for the opportunity to present our research today. And many thanks to Christine for this very kind and generous introduction and also for chairing the discussion. I will start speaking for about 10-12 minutes, and then Emily will follow up. So the plan is to say something about the motivation behind this piece and the key intervention, and locating our arguments within debates in international criminal law. And Emily will follow up addressing the implication of our critique for the larger field of international law by examining how ecocide is involved in reinforcing a specific vision of nature which may run against contemporary ecological imperatives. And I will start by sharing my screen, which should be, yeah, you should be able to see, right? This article is, of course, a collaborative project with my friend, Dr. Emily Jones. I remember we had a conversation a couple of years ago, just after the publication of this definition of ecocide in June 2021 by the so-called independent expert panel. This is a panel convened by a foundation, Stop Ecocide International, and is made by international lawyers and civil society representatives. And I remember both Emily and I were kind of skeptical of this initiative, aiming at codifying ecocide as another international crimes under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And the more we thought and exchanged ideas about it, the more we became clear that our concern was broader, and our skepticism vis-a-vis this proposed new crime was perhaps deeper and related to broader dynamics within the field of international law. So both Emily and I have previously worked and published on the role of international law in reproducing intersecting injustices and inequalities, building upon a variety of critical traditions, including feminist theory and Twale approaches. So while this new definition of ecocide by the International Expert Panel has attracted a lot of attention in international debates, we decided to focus in our article on 2 key problems or gaps in existing literature that we seek to address. So the first issue is that effort to codify ecocide and to expand humanity's law over environmental injustices are part of a problem-solving approach, which understands law as external to society, as a corrective to its evils. And this, we argue, reinforces the view that international law is only relevant if it can contribute to ex post facto accountability, in our case, punishment or constraining of action. So thinking in these terms about law is, of course, reductive. As post-colonial feminist Marxist scholars have amply shown, international law enables and facilitates as much as it constrains. And further, law is not just something, an objective force that exists out there, impacting neutrally on society, economy, and politics, but is in here, both constituted and constituted by social, economic, and political forces, as scholars have shown, notably Claire Cutler. So in this article, we decided to adopt a political economic lens to explore the distributive implication of codifying ecocide in international law. So why political economy? So over the past decade or so, a number of scholars have pointed out the interrelation of law and global political economic dynamics. And this vast literature has drawn attention to the role of international law in producing and distributing wealth and resources, illuminating the law's complicities with the structured injustices of modern capitalism. So examples include the work of our own chair, Christine Schwöbel-Patel, but also Susan Marks, Dina Zugala, Anna Chadwick, Robert Knox, Akbar Rasulov, to name just a few international lawyers that have worked on these issues and that we build upon, or on whose work we built upon in our article. Our second concern is the lack of consideration in the existing literature on ecocide for the interactions and possible tensions between different subfields of international law when it comes to questions of environmental governance. So to our best knowledge, no scholar has analyzed so far the turn to criminal law to protect nature from a broader disciplinary and theoretical perspective. So in this article, we seek to fill this gap by arguing that this silos thinking is not only unhelpful, but can actually be counterproductive when it comes to tackling questions of environmental injustices. Historians, political ecologists, and decolonial scholars have indeed shown that the separation of humanity and nature is the product of European modernist thinking, which paved the way also for colonization, domination, and the appropriation of the natural world. Present-day international law, which is fragmented in specialized subdisciplinary fields and technocratic institutions, is part of the same modernist project. And so if this mindset is part of the problem, we suggest it cannot be part of the solution. So this article thus aims to start a conversation on the turn to coercive tools, in this case international criminal law, as means of protecting nature and achieve environmental justice goals. Of course, this is a debate that we hope to continue well beyond the life of this article and possibly also drawing upon abolition feminist theory. So in reacting to those two gaps, our article proceeds in two steps. In the remainder of this presentation, I will give an overview of the first part of our article and argument, which locates ecocide within the political economy of international criminal law, and Emily will discuss the second part and offer then some more general conclusions. So since the end of the Cold War, international criminal law has become a dominant frame for defining and addressing issues of global justice. Examples, of course, include the creation of ad hoc criminal tribunals by the UN Security Council and the adoption of the Rome Statute in 1998, establishing a permanent international criminal court. Yet, in more recent years, a body of critical scholarship has emerged to highlight how the use of international criminal law often narrows the spectrum of possible responses to violence, and also delegitimizing alternative approaches and privileging a view of justice that dwells in the symbolic order. In reaction to this romanticized view of the field, critical scholars have shed light on the material conditions and political economic interests that underpin the international criminal law project. So in locating developments in international criminal law within the neoliberal paradigm, this literature has showed how global justice actors have often embraced a commodified or marketized version of justice, to refer to the term used by Schwöbel-Patel. So the concept of marketized justice is very helpful also to understand the recent proposal to incorporate ecocide within the International Criminal Court statute. So not only has Stop Ecocide, so the foundation behind this project, run a proper advertising campaign in support of it, but the very choice of the word ecocide indicates the desire for attention that characterizes international criminal law practices. And illuminating, we believe, is the following statement made by Philip Sands, one of the international expert panel members, during an interview with Al Jazeera in 2021. And you can see it here on the slide. Philip Sands says, interestingly, if you call it an environmental crime against humanity, no one cares. But if you call it ecocide, people sit up and say, oh yes, that is very important. We have done some polling about this in the context of the expert panel. We are taking Lemkin's magical word and giving it the machinery articulated by Dr. Pacht. So, of course, as we know, the choice of words matters when for how we understand a certain problem and the possible solution to it. So in thinking about the effects of framing global injustices in criminal law terms, it's also useful to refer to the work of Kamari Maxine Clark, in particular, the concept of spectacles of justice. Clark argues that spectacles of justice work together with spectacular capitalism to reproduce an economy of appearances, that is, the way economies work through different spectacles to camouflage particular economic processes. And here I was quoting from her own work. So in other words, spectacles of criminal justice, including international criminal trials, focus on culpability of individual perpetrators and episodes of injustices, while masking the broader structural political economic issues at play. So the turn to international criminal law then creates an illusion that by punishing a few bad actors, centuries of oppression based on race, class, and gender can be addressed. And in this way, they relieve pressure on the state and the international community to attend to questions of distribution that in many instances played a key role in fostering the violence and conflict in the first place. So what does this mean for ongoing efforts to codify ecocide? And here you can see the definition of it. So first of all, we argue that we must take seriously the political economy of invisibility. So meaning the routine working of prevailing economic structure across times and geographies. And by doing so, it becomes possible to see how unspectacular, everyday, ordinary forms of environmental violence get silenced in the practice of international law. So what Rob Nixon, for instance, calls law violence. So I'm thinking about the deaths caused by fossil residuals in water, land and air, the health impacts of intensive agricultural processes and uses of pesticides, the dumping of toxic waste near Black and poor communities, and the ongoing legacies of nuclear testing in the Pacific. Second, we claim that the codification of a crime of ecocide implies that it's possible to separate today's responsibility for most severe forms of environmental destruction from their historical and material conditions. Through the focus on most visible environmental externalities, the proposed definition of ecocide obscures the new colonial practices of resource extraction and land grabs by transnational corporations in the global south, and how this is part of a long history of indigenous dispossession. So it reinforces the progress narrative within the field, which obscures the continuities between unequal past, presents, and futures. And third, and lastly, we suggest turning to history and recovering other invocation of the term ecocide. And in the article in particular, we discuss how, for instance, scholars such as Richard Falk used the term in the 1970s to oppose US imperialism and environmental warfare in Vietnam, and notably the massive use of Agent Orange in the context of that conflict. So in doing so, it became then possible to contest the definition of the crime put forward by the independent expert panel, where ecocide, contrary to its history and perhaps more radical potentials, has become a depoliticizing technical tool to manage the social, ecological, economic crisis of modernity. So and now I hand over to Emily.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Eliana. So as Eliana noted, I'm going to talk to you today about our second main concern in the article, which is the lack of consideration in the existing literature on ecocide for the interactions and possible tensions between ecocide and international criminal law and other subfields of international law, particularly when looking at environmental governance. So kind of how is the environment seen in international law more broadly, and what can this tell us about ecocide really? So Marxist international lawyers, such as our fabulous discussant Christina, have argued that international law is structured around wealth accumulation. As Marx himself noted, the dominant mode of labour is the central knot that mediates our relationship with nature. A core element that is thereby exposed when looking at the way capitalism operates through and in international law is the deeply material nature of the law, and the way the law also situates the particular white, wealthy male human in hierarchical priority over the non-human environment. So in this context, I hope to show you today that situating ecocide within international law more broadly and its critiques opens up new ways of critically analysing ecocide. And so to make this argument, we situate ecocide by drawing on a broad array of frameworks in international law. So looking at particularly international environmental law, debates on the regulation of deep sea mining, and discussions in the field of business and human rights. And I'm going to try my best to go through all of those in 10 minutes today. Overall, what we're trying to argue, and what I hope I'll get across, is that the proposed crime of ecocide seeks to reconcile ecological preservation and devastation while failing to challenge the violent structures of extractive capitalism and its racialized, classed, and gendered hierarchies. So basically, it fails to address the root causes of the environmental issues that proponents of the crime claim that it will address. We're also hoping that this will be interesting for those of you working on abolition feminisms. And I know there's many of you, of course, in this Zoom room doing that. Kind of a side note, we actually originally had abolition feminism as part of this paper, and then it just got way too big. And we were like, we can't do Marxism and political economy and feminism. So we've kind of separated these off. So we hope to be writing a second paper from an abolitionist feminist perspective. But I think the kind of links with this paper in particular is because, like abolition feminism, we're seeking to understand how a specific crime, which on the face of it might look like and be presented as inherently good in the sense that it's good for the environment, there are kind of links there with the way that criminal law is used in terms of abolition feminism, how crime is being used as good for women in the name of protecting against sexual violence, etc. But as abolition feminists have shown, that kind of good for women actually risks doing harm, often to the community that it's actually seeking to support, as well as multiple other communities, particularly along kind of racialized and classed lines. So kind of challenging, what happens when you try and use criminal law for something that seems like a good cause, I guess, and looking at the kind of more broader structural issues, I think is the sort of key link here. But to kind of go back to thinking about ecocide in the paper more specifically, our first example that we want to situate the crime within is international environmental law, and particularly the paradigm of sustainable development. So the centering of certain human and particularly human economic interests over all others in international law can be seen by looking at the principle of sustainable development, which is generally seen to be the kind of underlying principle of all international environmental law. This principle is made up of several components, but it basically seeks to balance economic development needs on the one hand with the need to protect the environment on the other. So really what it's purporting is that economic growth can coexist with environmental protection. However, as a lot of scholars have pointed out, this kind of is intended to give the impression that only minor corrections to the capitalist market economy need to be implemented to address environmental issues. But really, these critical scholars note, can we have like capitalist growth with environmental protection? Arguably, those things are just too contradictory, and we need different models of economy. So it's become clear over the past few decades that the principle of sustainable development is an impossibility in many senses. How can we address the environmental crisis while also continuing to exploit the environment for economic gains? We argue that it's important to then situate debates on ecocide within this wider history and disciplinary trend. This is because international law, and particularly international environmental law, treats the environment as an object that can and should be exploited for human gain. And the definition of ecocide would be inserted into this normative framework. However, by separating ecology and economy and failing to recognise the way the two are deeply entwined, international law actually creates the conditions in which ecocide can occur. So it becomes clear that an international crime of ecocide, if adopted, would intervene to ensure an ex post facto accountability and limited redress for the worst forms of environmental harm, often caused by economic development activities. So to develop this argument further, I want to turn to the existing definition of ecocide, and you can see on your screen also the kind of elements of that definition. So the current definition of ecocide, as Eliana noted, focuses on unlawful or wanton acts which are likely to result in ecocide. So that's the kind of criminalizing element. While the meaning of unlawful is to some extent intuitive, wanton is defined, as you can see on the slide, as reckless disregard for damage, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. Wanton has been further defined by one of the authors of the definition as long-term and severe environmental damage. So it therefore applies to lawful acts that are excessive. So this excessive nature is the criminalizing factor. In some ways, this doesn't sound so different to the way sustainable development operates. If there are economic benefits, then a considerable amount of environmental damage can be justified under the way existing international environmental law works. And so given this, it seems likely that only the real extremes will be caught by ecocide, or the most spectacular crimes, to refer back to what Eliana was examining previously. And this is really worrying because this means that acts that may cause vast amounts of environmental damage, but are deemed to be legal and economically necessary, will not fall under ecocide. And I'm sure we can kind of think of many examples in that instance. So to examine this in more detail, I want to turn now to my deep sea mining regulation example. So deep sea mining regulation is currently being debated at the International Seabed Authority, and I promise that this does link back to ecocide. But while multiple civil society organisations and some states have called for a moratorium, noting that scientists warn that the environmental impacts are vast and are largely unknown because we just know so little about the deep sea, discussions to draft a mining code to legally authorise this are still underway. So the mining code is supposed to be drafted in the next few years. It was technically supposed to be already drafted for June 2021, and they've extended the debates, etc. And, you know, the debates here are kind of, oh, well, we need to mine these minerals because these are minerals that we need for the green economy versus, of course, the environmental impacts, and the two kind of contrasting debates. But despite these delays, despite the controversies, it seems likely that deep sea mining will probably be legally authorized in international law within the next decade, if not the next few years. So any proposed regulations to legally authorize deep sea mining would make it legal. So there'd be all of these debates over many years with state parties, etc. And that would therefore justify this mass damage in the name of economic gain in the end. But the problem here is that this means that deep sea mining would inherently fall outside of the scope of the proposed crime of ecocide, because it's been debated, it's been made lawful, and supposedly those kind of elements that would make it wanton have been debated enough that it's fine. You know, there'll be environmental impact assessments, etc. But this is really interesting because deep sea mining is actually used regularly by the proponents of ecocide as an example of exactly why the crime is needed. So we're kind of saying actually the definition suggests that this won't be covered, even though that's used a lot in the publicity. So this is a good example of how ecocide will capture the most extreme instances of environmental damage. But again, often this kind of slow violence that Eliana was talking about, the kind of everyday acts of environmental degradation, will not be captured. This leads us on to our third example, which I'll try and go through fairly quickly because I want to leave time for discussion. But this is business and human rights. So the proposed crime, as it's stated by proponents, is intended to tackle both state and corporate accountability. But the field of business and human rights exposes the difficulties already faced with holding corporations to account in international law. This is because the business and human rights framework generally is, critical scholars have shown it's seen as promoting human rights worldwide, but in the meantime, corporations, as we know, violate human rights all the time. We can think about kind of, sort of mass production of clothes in factories in the global south, etc. And these dynamics play a central role in upholding a capitalist system that fosters global inequalities. This has therefore led scholars such as Gritcha Bars to argue that the field of business and human rights, very much like the principle of sustainable development, we argue, is an oxymoron. Because at the end, economic development in capitalist mode cannot exist alongside any meaningful addressal of environmental issues. So in some, ecocide, like business and human rights frameworks, will at best tackle only the most serious conducts. However, this ultimately means that very few acts will be captured under the current framing. Rather, it will be the most spectacular events. And this is concerning because that means those more everyday acts, the kind of smaller amounts of chemicals released into the environment, mining that is legally authorized, will not only not be captured, but actually is normalized by being marked as not criminal. So to draw to a conclusion, it's clear that we need more critical engagement with ecocide from within international criminal law, also looking at international law more broadly. And we've sought to kind of begin that conversation around the political economic dynamics. But as I noted, moving forward, we really hope to examine the proposed crime of ecocide by drawing on abolition feminist ideas, asking what can be learned from the take-up of women by international criminal law for those examining the emerging take-up of the environment. So if anyone has any thoughts in particular on that, we welcome thoughts on any part of the paper, of course, and questions, but we're particularly interested in that. It's something we're thinking about a lot. So I will end on that note, and thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eliana and Emily, for giving us such a comprehensive but also really pointed overview of your really cutting edge research. So I thought I'd start us off with a discussion while people